The night air was heavy with the scent of dust and oil, the kind of smell that seeped into every stitch of fabric and every crevice of the body. Private Jackson lay on his cot, staring at the canvas roof of the tent as the dim light of a lantern flickered, making shadows dance like ghosts across the ceiling. The day had been long, filled with endless drills under the blistering sun, carrying packs that weighed more than seemed humanly possible, and standing at attention until his legs trembled. He turned on his side, wincing at the ache in his back. His uniform was damp with sweat that had dried hours ago but left behind a stubborn salt crust on his skin. He could hear the low murmur of men talking quietly, the occasional laugh that carried a note of exhaustion rather than joy. Everyone was bone-tired. Training wasn't just about building muscle, it was about breaking the spirit and seeing who could endure the grind. Every day felt like a test not only of strength but of will. He remembered the words of his drill sergeant earlier that morning, "The army doesn't need bodies. It needs soldiers." There's a difference. At the time, Jackson wanted to curse the man, but now, lying in the suffocating heat of the tent, he wondered if those words had some hidden truth. "Hey, Jackson," a voice whispered from the next cot. It was Davis, a lanky recruit with a permanent grin, even when his lips were cracked from dehydration. "Think we'll live through tomorrow?" Jackson let out a dry laugh. "If we don't, I'm haunting the sergeant." That got a soft chuckle out of Davis. "Nah, he'd probably yell at your ghost to stand straighter." The humor was thin, brittle, but it helped. It was these brief moments of camaraderie that kept them sane. The army was hard, but it wasn't endured alone. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the bark of orders, the sound of boots pounding gravel, or the distant thud of artillery practice that never seemed to end. When reveille blared before dawn, Jackson dragged himself up with a groan. His body felt like it had been beaten with hammers. Still, he forced himself into his uniform, laced up his boots, and fell into line. Discipline wasn't a choice, it was survival. The day began with a 5-mile run, packs strapped tightly to their backs, rifles in hand. The air was cold, stinging his lungs, but sweat soon poured down his face, blurring his vision. One of the men stumbled, collapsing on the dirt road. The sergeant didn't even pause, he screamed at the rest to keep moving, as if the fallen man had never existed. Jackson gritted his teeth and pushed forward, his legs burning, his heart pounding. By the time they reached the end, he was gasping, bent over with his hands on his knees, but he had made it. Later came weapons drills, crawling through mud while machine gun fire rattled above their heads. Jackson felt the earth press against his face, the dampness soaking into his uniform. He smelled the acrid sting of gunpowder in the air, heard the shouts of his comrades, and kept pushing forward, inch by inch. When he finally made it out of the course, his body was caked in mud, and his hands were raw, but he had done it without hesitation. He wasn't sure if it was courage or simply fear of being left behind. "Private Jackson," the sergeant barked, looming over him. "You want to take a nap in that mud or you gonna stand like a soldier?" Jackson scrambled to his feet, panting. "Sir, yes, sir." The sergeant gave him a hard look but moved on. That small acknowledgement, the fact that he hadn't been singled out for punishment, felt like a victory. At mess, the food was barely edible, gray lumps of meat and potatoes that had long since lost their flavor. But hunger didn't allow complaints. The men ate quickly, exchanging few words, each of them locked in their private battle against exhaustion. Jackson thought of home as he chewed, his mother's kitchen, the smell of fried chicken, the laughter of his little sister. It seemed like another life, one that belonged to someone else. Here, home was a memory used to fuel endurance, a reminder of what he was fighting for even if he didn't fully understand the cause yet. That night, Davis leaned over again, his face pale under the dim light. "You ever think about what happens after all this?" Jackson stared at the tent ceiling. "I don't even know if I'll make it through tomorrow. After, that's too far to think." But deep down, he knew. The army was shaping him, molding him into something harder, something unyielding. But at what cost, he wondered as his eyes drifted shut. He feared that the boy who had enlisted just months ago was already gone, replaced by someone he didn't quite recognize yet. Someone forged by fire and fatigue. The war zone was nothing like training. Training had been brutal, yes, but there was always the knowledge that it was controlled, that somewhere beyond the mud and sweat and curses, safety still existed. Out here, on foreign soil, that illusion vanished. The world smelled of smoke and blood, the ground trembled with distant shellfire, and the air carried a silence broken only by the occasional burst of gunfire that echoed like a grim reminder of death's nearness. Jackson crouched low behind a crumbling wall, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. His uniform was torn and streaked with dirt, his face smeared with grime. Sweat trickled down his temples despite the cool night. His squad was scattered across the ruined village, their breaths loud in the comms, short and clipped. They had been sent to clear the area, but the enemy wasn't invisible like during training. They were real, cunning, and determined to kill. He peeked around the corner just in time to see movement. A flash of metal, the crack of a shot, and a bullet chipped the wall inches from his head. He ducked back, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. For a moment, fear threatened to paralyze him. His hands trembled, and he thought of home again, the small things, like his sister's smile, the warmth of his mother's hug. But there was no room for hesitation. Hesitation meant death. Move, his sergeant barked through the radio, and Jackson obeyed without thinking. He sprinted across the open street, bullets snapping at his heels, and dove behind another pile of rubble. His chest burned, his lungs screamed, but he was alive. One of his squad mates wasn't so lucky. Jackson had seen him go down, the red spreading across his vest, his body crumpling lifelessly onto the dirt. There was no time to grieve, no time to process. The living had to keep moving. The fighting dragged on. Hours blurred into a haze of gunfire, shouted orders, and the metallic tang of blood in the air. Jackson fired until his shoulder ached from the recoil, until his ears rang from the thunder of explosions. His throat was raw from shouting, his body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. Reload, Davis shouted nearby, ducking behind the same wall. His face was streaked with dirt, but his grin was gone. In its place was grim determination. Jackson slammed another magazine into his rifle, hands shaking. I got you covered. They moved in sync, not because they planned it, but because survival demanded it. Training had drilled it into them: cover, move, fire, repeat. The village became a graveyard of shattered buildings and broken men. By the time the firefight ended, dawn had broken, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that felt cruel against the devastation below. Jackson sat against a wall, his rifle across his lap, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Around him, the survivors were few, their faces hollow, eyes glazed with the weight of what they had seen. The sergeant walked past, giving no words of comfort, only a nod that meant they had survived, for now. Survival was the only reward the army promised. Medics moved in to collect the wounded and the dead. Jackson's gaze fell on the body of his fallen friend, Perez, a quiet kid who had once shared half his rations when Jackson was starving. He forced himself not to look too long, not to let the grief consume him. He had learned that in the army, death was always close, always waiting. You carried it with you, not as a burden but as a shadow that never left. That night, as he lay in his trench with the cold ground beneath him and the endless sky above, Jackson realized something. The army was hard, yes. It broke men down, crushed them, remade them. But the hardest part wasn't the pain, or the fear, or the endless struggle. The hardest part was carrying the memories, the faces of those who wouldn't see home again, the knowledge that he would never be the same boy who had once dreamt of serving with pride. He stared up at the stars, his rifle beside him, and whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for the ones who had fallen, and for the strength to make it through one more day.